Sylvia and me.
Sylvia and
Sylvia and me. Sylvia and
Sylvia. Sylvia and me.
Wall Street is being manned by women, right? It's the ones who make the money, who do the trades, who are the brokers. They're all men, all men. But the support staff, they're women, right? So it's and they start to find their way in. They watch the ones who sort of it sparks them when they get there, and they're watching and they're learning.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Beckerman, host of the podcast series Sylvia and Me. Conversations with inspiring, empowering women.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Paulina Bren, and I'm the author of a book that's coming out on September 17th, She-Wolves, The Untold History of Women on Wall Street. And before that, I wrote the Barbizon, the hotel that set women free. So this is the second time I'm here with Sylvia. So Sylvia and me, here we go.
Paulina, thank you so much for joining me. As you said, you were here about 3 years ago.
Yep.
When the Barbizon, which I absolutely, I loved, and I couldn't wait to get my hands on a copy of She-Wolves, the Women of Wall Street. Amazing. And it's, to me, it kind of like almost flows from the time of the Barbizon, because now we're talking from the 60s all the way through to the present. And one of the things, I know this is kind of in the back towards the end of the book, but I think it kind of gives a feeling as to maybe why this is so interesting, because we're going to talk about so many of these women. And towards the end of the book, you write, power has shifted from trading desks to investment banking, hedge funds, and especially private equity firms. Tellingly, in 2022, women were only 12% of managing directors and 16% of principals and partners at private equity firms. Fewer than 1 in 10 women sit on the investment committees where private equity investment decisions are made. Women's perspectives, in other words, are usually missing in decisions that have long-term effects for us all. Women of color fare the worst, while all women start to fall off the conveyor belt from entry level to the C-suite. And the reason why I thought that was so important to start off with is because you're going back and we're going to talk about why you thought this was so important, and then the women who made this happen. And as the Virginia Slim slogan, we've come a long way,
Come
baby.
a long way, baby. We of a certain age remember that slogan.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. And also the Rosie, the Riveter, we've come a long way, baby. And to some extent, yes, but we have to then take a look where we have. So let's start with, why did you think this was so important?
Well, you said when we were just speaking informally that it felt like a sort of a continuation in many ways of the Barbizon, and I agree with that, because what was interesting to me is I was writing the Barbizon. Sort of the heyday was the 1950s, sort of going into the 1960s. And then you look at the late 1960s and the 70s when, New York is at its worst, right? And you would think that is the moment that women really want to congregate in safety with each other in a secure residential hotel on the Upper East Side. But no, that's the moment where the Barbizon starts to fall out of favor. Women don't want to stay there anymore. And that is very telling about certain things, including if in many ways the Barbizon held sort of the quintessential woman who is coming to New York, who is sort of working out her ambitions in New York from the late 1920s through the end of the 1950s. But it was a very different type of woman now in New York, and a very different New York. And in a sense, I sort of followed that woman out of the Barbizon Hotel, to Wall Street. And when I started to think, like, this is another space I could explore, that really we have so many memoirs by women who worked on Wall Street, but they're not historians. And the memoirs are sort of, some of them are good and they can be amusing, they can be interesting, but there's almost this tone of like, I was there, but how did this even happen? Because there's no context, right? And so what I did for the Barbizon and telling a story of women in New York, I wanted to do for Wall Street and the women who tried to scale that wall from the 1950s through 9/11 and give it a context. Like, yes, we all know it's a misogynistic place, right? But what does that mean? Where does it come from? Like, how did it stop? What did that mean in the 50s versus 60s versus 70s, 80s? And so that was really interesting to me. But I have to say, when I came up with this idea and I was interested, I mean, I was really one of those people who, I'm a professor at Vassar College. I'm a historian, but I was one of those people who, and there are many of us who, in conversation, somebody would say something about Wall Street, and I'd be like, I knew nothing about Wall Street. I don't really have friends in finance. I have one or two, more like one. So this was a new world to me too. But I think it really played to my advantage because I had to figure out this world and explain it. Not just the women coming there. Not just telling their story, but it's also a story of Wall Street.
Well, that's it. That's what's so fascinating, because it is the story of Wall Street, whereas the Barbizon was the story of where women, it was a safe place for women. But again, back in those days, these women who were going during the Barbizon era, who were going to college or going to secretarial school or being a model, they were supposed to be doing this just in the interim because their eyes were supposed to be out looking for a husband to then go settle in the suburbs and raise a family.
About the Wall Street woman. Exactly. Here we have a different species of women because the times have changed, right? There's not the idea of marriage is not childhood. That's a whole, having children, bearing children, that's a whole other thing. But certainly marriage is not hanging over you like a sword anymore. So you can start to think in terms of career more, more so than a job. But nevertheless, what was fascinating to me, like if I were to write a history of women on Wall Street from 2000 to today, it would be a very different book. And frankly, it wouldn't be that interesting to me. What was really interesting to me was to discover that Wall Street in the 60s, the 70s, first of all, we all know it was a little sort of male,
a little
exactly, boys network kind of club, but it was a little enclave. It was really provincial. It was this place that nobody went to. It emptied out at 5 o'clock, but everybody knew each other. When you said if your firm was on Wall Street, it was on Wall Street. It was in that area. It wasn't Midtown. It wasn't Uptown. And so everybody knew each other, had a very different atmosphere. Firms on Wall Street, they were all partner owned. They weren't publicly traded yet, really. And so that didn't happen until 1970. And so it was and then very slowly. So it was a really interesting atmosphere. And the women who were getting sort of their foot in the door, they weren't necessarily, I mean, it really shifts in 1980, but in the 1960s and 70s, they're not women who have this dream of making it big on Wall Street. They're women, most of them, or a lot of them, I should, to be fair, a lot of them are college dropouts. They are looking for secretarial work because the women's movement is taking place. That doesn't mean that the jobs have expanded greatly for women, right? It's still nurse, secretary, clerk, right? All those receptionist, all those kinds of jobs. And so these women who just looking for a job in the areas that, you know, clerical support, the only area where they can find work, they go to employment agencies and they find, well, there are these 3 jobs and one of them pays a bit more, and that job's on Wall Street, right? And so that's how they start, because Wall Street is being manned by women, right? It's the ones who make the money, who do the trades, who are the brokers. They're all men, all men. But the support staff, they're women, right? So it's and they start to find their way in. They watch the ones who sort of, you know, sort of it sparks them when they get there, and they're watching and they're learning.
Yes, and they're watching and they're learning, and they're again in those jobs that the women, Barbizon, you know, the secretaries, the receptionists, then of course anyone who was not on the floor. And when we think about Wall Street in the old movies, even on The Wolf of Wall Street, when we're looking at men yelling on the floor and handing papers and you know, yelling and screaming, and the ticker tape going around eventually. But women were never on the floor. But where they were, as far as secretaries, they were also research analysts.
Yes.
Which was
yeah.
a very, you know, that was very specific, and it without the men realizing it, it was giving women power in knowledge is power.
Yeah.
And the information that
they were creeping in through research analyst positions. Exactly. So that basically means, for those of you who are just like me, what is a research analyst, you might ask? It's, and of course, you know, another fun thing is that these terms change over time. So somebody says analyst in 1970, it means something very different in 1980. But research analysts are the people who would analyze, would do the research on companies, usually on a sector. So women were often given cosmetics and pharmaceuticals because that was their wheelhouse, right? And they would do research into companies, they'd meet the CEOs, and they would evaluate these companies, and then they would recommend certain stocks, which those recommendations would be passed from broker to clients and so forth. And they would write these reports. And the thing is, they didn't have to write their full name. They would write initials. So, you know, for Paulina Bren, I'd write P. Bren. So you wouldn't know if I'm Paul or Peter Bren. And that was, but the thing is these women themselves noted that the research analyst world was, you know, there were certainly men there, but they were like the really nerdy men that sort of the trader men didn't respect at all either. They, you know, they were the ones, sort of the sweaty men with glasses, you know, who weren't, you know, backslapping each other. They were also interested in just sort of sitting there and doing the research. But that was that. So you already had sort of, it was already a feminized zone, in other words, what I'm trying to say. So women were able to sort of slide in there. Yeah, and that was in many ways the beginning, the sort of the beginning rung for many women who came in initially as secretaries and receptionists. Yes.
I want to jump to, and it's probably not jumping much, to Harvard Business School and 8 women. And can you tell us what was going on then? Because again, here you have a situation where 8, we're counting 8, that's not even a full 2 hands, women who actually made history, although most of us don't know about it, and sort of broke into, in a roundabout way, into Wall Street.
Absolutely. And before I say that, you just triggered something in me that I wanted to say when you said we don't know, made history, but we don't know about them. The thing that really struck me as I started to do the research, like I know how hard it is to do research about women's lives. The Barbizon, as we discussed, no original sources are left. It was incredibly difficult to resurrect these women's lives and the hotel in which they lived. This I thought was going to be much easier, but it was shocking that these women who are alive today and not particularly elderly, they barely, if at all, have any kind of internet presence. You can't find them. Like you have no idea who they are. It's impossible. There's a wonderful book about sort of the ups and downs of what happened on Wall Street and the economic and financial cycles, and it's entirely told through interviews with sort of the big money makers on Wall Street. It's well over 600 pages. There are two pages, an interview with a woman. And of course, that woman is Mickie Siebert, the most famous woman on Wall Street. That is it. That is it. It's a fairly recent book. Okay. I just want to say,
put it into context.
Like,
yes.
The level of invisibility is shocking. Anyway, so I hope this, this corrects that to some extent. Anyway, yes, Harvard Business School in 1963, they let in the first 8 women, and it's like 364 men and 8 women. And the official first woman is this woman, Elaine Luthi, who was an English major at Stanford. She takes the bus over to Cambridge, cross country. Anyway, and she's dubbed the blonde bomb of Harvard Business School, right? And there's one in the book, these official Harvard Business School photographs of her. She's very pretty, very Jackie O in her outfit. But these 8 women, oh my goodness, they did not have an easy time of it. Nor did the women coming after them for the following 10 years, but particularly the first 8 women, I'd say. The kind of, the male students just would not accept them. They kept telling them that they're taking the spot of a wage earner, a breadwinner, just complete befuddlement why they're there. The faculty that was sort of forced, they voted for simply because everywhere else at Harvard at that point, women were accepted and they sort of were in a position where they had to, but they didn't know what to do with the women. And it wasn't as if they hadn't encountered them before, because across the river, Radcliffe had actually had like a 1-year business program for decades. And the men at the Harvard Business School, the professors, would teach those women too on their campus. But suddenly being in the midst of men, they didn't know what to do. They wouldn't call on them when they had their hands up. They wouldn't make eye contact with them. They asked them to leave when it was any sensitive discussion that might involve discussion of a woman. There was, God forbid a woman is there when women's consumer products and, or there was a discussion about Playboy magazine, and this woman, her 3 children, was asked to leave because she might see breasts. So they had an incredibly difficult time. And then, it was just a question of survival, just getting through those 2 years. And of course, of the second year, spring recruitment comes, and they're all trying to get jobs, and they're laughed out of interviews. Like, nobody will interview them. It was a sorry state. And all 8 of them, later on, they sort of made their way into finance. Some of them later on were successful, but the first few years were very dismal. And then the first Black woman, Lillian Hobson, who arrives in 1967, which means she's there for 1968. And she had no idea. She had no idea she was going to be the only Black woman. And we're still talking about like 12 women, right? The only difference is that now there's 11 white women and 1 Black woman. And she was looking around for the first weeks, like, where is, another Black woman? And she told me not even, she's written a lovely memoir. And she said, it wasn't even other students, like she was looking administrators, anybody. The only other Black woman she could find was somebody cleaning. So you can imagine, the level of isolation that these women experienced, especially Lillian Hobson, it was daunting.
And yet some of these women went on to work in Wall Street, and in between, not just sexism, they were just totally ignored, given jobs that they thought women would be invisible and not do anything. they were in for a slight shock, because a lot of these women started getting together, and there were a couple of groups that took place where women actually started talking to one another and exchanging information. Again, information, power,
Yeah.
power of information.
And that was one of the things I should say, that the way, and it then happens again to another woman, but I won't go into that. The way one survived at Harvard Business School in those days is that you joined an informal study group. That was the only way you could do it, because so much work was thrown at you, you had to divvy it up. And the women were excluded from that.
Yep.
And that made being, graduating, even, they all graduated, but graduate, and in fact, admissions office had been told to find 8 women who would graduate no matter what, because they were that smart. But it was such a toll to be doing that work alone. And they foolishly, I asked Lillian, like, why did you not all, as women, most of you living at this remote Radcliffe Graduate Center, why didn't you get together and become your own group? And she said they told us not to do that, and we somehow listened. They just didn't know.
Well, luckily, yes, they listened then, but then information, they started talking to one another.
Yeah.
And they had a couple of groups, and one of them was the Glass Ceiling Club, so that they could, again, they could exchange knowledge that they had.
Well, that didn't happen till the 1990s. The women at Bear Stearns got together and sort of informally after a dinner one time, and they realized that they needed to get together on a monthly basis if possible. And they really did. They passed on information like, who's the worst groper? Who should you stay away from? Who should you meet in a public space, sort of on the trading floor, as opposed to in an office, and so forth. This is really valuable information. And so you definitely see that happening. It starts to happen in the 90s, where on the one hand, you start to see class action suits on Wall Street. And that class action suits is really important because, as I discuss in the book, when you work on Wall Street, you basically sign a contract saying that you will, if you have a complaint, you are waiving your right to take it to court. So anything that happens has to go through an arbitration process, which is judged by 3 people, and basically majority are old white men. I could go on and on. There's a database, which is, really, you can't do a search on it. If you lodge a complaint, your name is on it. If you're complained against, if you are the one who's the perpetrator, your name doesn't show up. It just goes on and on. And to give you a sense of what this all looks like, there's also such a level of secrecy. I should say this. It wasn't like I was just able to walk in and talk to women. It was hard. It was hard because women but the thing is, I didn't want this either. I didn't want to write just a book about misogyny. I wasn't interested in that.
No, you've written a book which does not just talk about it. Talks about how the women were able to stand up for themselves, and in getting together and sharing what they knew, were able to get on the floor, were able to start their own businesses. And so you mentioned one of the most famous, and I want to talk about her a little bit, Mickie Siebert.
Yeah.
Tell us what did she do that just makes her, anyone on Wall Street knows, especially women, knows who she is.
Everyone knows who she is. No, everyone. Exactly. She was a pioneer, and she would not take no for an answer. She arrived on Wall Street in 1954 in a banged up Studebaker. Her father just died of cancer. She was not going to stick around in Ohio, and she'd been in New York the summer before as a tourist. And one of the things she'd seen was the New York Stock Exchange. And as sort of like a little tourist thing at the end of the tour, they gave you a little piece of your ticket tape and her said, welcome to Wall Street, Muriel. And indeed, welcome to Wall Street. She took the route we've been talking about, where she started as a secretary and then she found a way into doing research analysis. And what was happening, this happened not just to her, it happened to Beth Data too, where these older research analysts, whenever they were doing well, they were allowed to sort of shed some of their work and give it to the junior people. And sometimes they didn't have the foresight. So she got airlines because from a train guy who didn't think the airlines were going anywhere. So she became a research analyst who was an expert on the airline industry. And she was just known throughout Wall Street. But she kept hitting, the term glass ceiling didn't come about until much, much later. But she kept banging her head against the glass ceiling. This was a time, so you had the big firms, Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, and so forth. She couldn't get a job there. Women could not get a job there other than secretary. There was no movement. So this is the thing, when I started by saying Wall Street was a very different place. It was provincial, it was small, it was quaint. Everybody knew each other. That's because there were all these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of really small brokerage firms, like 2 partners, 5 employees or whatever. And that's where women were able to get their foot in. And that's what she was doing. So she then became a partner, but it was always in a small firm. And she wanted more. She wanted to be at the big table, and she couldn't get to the big table. So a very famous investor, a friend of hers, Gerald Sy, suggested to her that she buy a seat in the New York Stock Exchange. She's like, what? Because there were no women no women owned. And the question was, were women even allowed to buy? And it turns out that the NYSE, the New York Stock Exchange, has a constitution written just shortly after the American Constitution, like 3-4 years, something like that. And guess what? There's nothing saying women can't buy a seat because they didn't have the foresight to say that, right? And so she could. She did, with great difficulty, because she had to get a loan from a bank. Banks. This is a time where you couldn't,
Women couldn't get a loan
unless you had a co-signer who was a male. And she needed a big whopping loan. And also suddenly the New York Stock Exchange was vetting her, which hadn't happened to a single other male member who was applying. Anyway, but she did it. She did it. And January 1st, 1968, she became the first woman to have a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. But that did not mean she traded on the floor. She knew well enough not to do that. She even said it outright. She said, I don't want to make more enemies. So she used what's called a $2 broker, which these are freelance brokers on the floor in those days. And the seat gave her sort of accessibility and prestige for her firm that she opened up. But she was, I mean, incredibly successful. Just a character. I mean, I think that was part of the thing too. Why
she's a character. Yes,
like she was a character. She was just she was amazing. She was amazing. And Siebert and Company still exists. They actually just got in touch with me. They want me to do a whole bunch of things. But yeah. So she's the icon, but she did not trade on the floor. And the first woman to trade on the floor is one of those women you've never heard about. And she went through hell.
I'm sure. The men didn't want her there.
Oh no, Alice Jocko, she was the one who she got on the floor. The profanities said, whispered as she would pass by. The dildos sent down the pneumatic tubes that were used to send stock trades up to the stock room. Instead, she got that. It goes on and on. She had to have a police escort for a while.
But she persists.
She really did. That's the thing. These stories are fascinating. I try to eventually they start as individual stories and then they become interwoven to a certain extent in the book. And because they all share a similar fate. And some of them drop out, but many of them persist. And also, let's not forget, they make a lot of money.
They make a lot of money.
They make a lot of money.
Yes.
And that was also fascinating to me. Like, they're out there making a lot of money at a time. And that's the thing, like, on the one hand, what they had to deal with was shocking. Not that it was that great anywhere else, but it was particularly blatant on Wall Street. On the other hand, they know they're making a lot more than they could make anywhere else, and then women in the American workforce are making, right?
Well,
So
most
you're
women were
making
teachers
that
instead.
trade, which I think is a legit, if that's the trade you want to make, go for it.
Well, I want to mention one other woman only because I spoke to her when her story is an amazing story, but also she was called the Witch of Wall Street and had no idea that was being said behind her back. And that is a woman, Patricia Chadwick, who came from being thrown out of a cult at the age of 17 and just worked her way through. And again, no one was stopping her.
Yeah. And that's why she really does. She is, again, representative of these, other than, not, she was unusual in having been in a Catholic cult that she basically had to bargain her way out of. And part of it was to get into Vassar College. That's how she got her way out of the cult, so she could prove that the cult could get state accreditation for educating their children. She got into Vassar, and then the cult immediately made her turn down her spot at Vassar. As I sit in my Vassar College office right here. But she has this amazing, completely unique story, but at the same time, she also has a story that so many of these women have, which is when she was forced to turn down her spot at Vassar, once she got out of the cult, she had nothing. She needed something, so she got a secretarial certificate. And she started working in a brokerage firm, right? And that is how she started to climb the ladder. And that's what they did. Like, there was just this ingenuity, this persistence that these early women in the 60s and 70s had, which is really admirable. And they all really quite characters and have, this fierceness. They're a little bit scary, to be honest with you. They have this ferocity about them. But what was interesting, then you have this new wave that comes in the early 1980s when Wall Street goes from this enclave to like the engine, the center, the epicenter of our country, our economy, and our values, and people are streaming from the Ivy Leagues, from the business schools onto Wall Street. Before you went to business school, your purpose was not Wall Street most of the time. You wanted to become an industrialist. You want to become a CEO eventually of a company. So now these women like Patricia are looking at these women coming in the 80s who have a completely different ethos, different expectations, and they don't love them that much. There's a feeling of I worked so hard, you have no idea, and you're just prancing in here because they're sort of the beneficiaries of the women's movement, but ultimately, they're not. That'll give you the first two rungs of the ladder, it turns out, not the rest of it. But they have a different sensibility, they're highly educated, their expectations are enormous, and they go into sort of these very highly paid, almost like conveyor belts that now Wall Street firms set up, called the analyst program, not the research analyst program, very different, very different. Analyst program if you come from college, associate program if you come from business school. And now it's just a completely different scene. You've got yuppie New York now coming from, graffitied, urine stained 1970s New York. Everything is so different. And you have, these two groups of women are sort of looking at each other with great suspicion. I think in retrospect, I mean, Joanne Lippman certainly felt that way, who came in with a friend who went onto Wall Street. They're both from Yale, graduated in 1983. She went on to work for the Wall Street Journal. And they were looking down on these women who had struggled so hard during the 1970s. But, she later wrote an op-ed saying, we were wrong. We were so misguided. We thought we were reaping the fruits of sort of that feminism was over, that we were done with it. And we just, the world was our oyster, and we were just so wrong.
Well, there was a terminology, financial feminism.
That is a new thing. That is actually a new thing, not an 80s thing. There are women who have, actually, it's often spearheaded by women who've done very well on Wall Street in the 2000s,
Okay.
retired or semi-retired, and they're looking to think about different ways about how women power and money can work. And financial feminism, but it's an idea that's been around for a long time, actually, through much of the 20th century. The idea that women, if they were only to, in a sense, vote with their pocketbooks, like that it matters where you put your money. And if you think about where to put it, sort of conscientiously and in a feminist mode, you can make change.
Well, there was a review, the caucus review, and I love what they say. Throughout this fascinating business and culture history, Bren, it's you, fleshes out the story with instructive anecdotes, and she provides series of biographical sketches in an appendix. While the situation has markedly improved, there are still far too few women in positions of power and leadership in the finance industry. We might hope that Bren returns to the subject in another decade or two for a further assessment. As we started off with the Virginia Slim slogan, we've come a long way, baby. Have we?
And that's the thing. All these women would say to me at the end of the, interview, I'd be like, so how is it now? Because I'm not writing a book about today, but of course I was curious, and I finished the book with that, with sort of a contemporary look. And they would all just roll their eyes and they'd say, I'm giving up on, I've been on so many gender and diversity, sort of boards, right? Associations, leadership roles. And like nothing changes. And for a second, I'll put my sort of historian hat on. There's a very famous historian called Judith Bennett, and she makes the argument, which she was actually studying women brewsters, women who brew beer in the Middle Ages. And she made the great theoretical sort of recognition that there's a huge difference between change and transformation. So you could see change, which means there are a lot of women on Wall Street now, a lot, but that doesn't mean necessarily transformation. And I think that's really a perfect case of it.
I want to end this by talking about the fearless girl, the small 4 feet tall bronze statue. Can you tell us how it got to where it is now? Yes. And why? Because this is hysterical.
I know it is hysterical. And it's
so, I mean,
it encapsulates the entire story. So, so this company, this firm, Wall Street firm, which investment firm, which I won't name right now, but it's in the book, it's in the photo, was the one that paid for an artist to design and create a statue that would be sort of representative of women, or say something about gender and the power of women on Wall Street. It wanted to sort of bolster its profile.
And this was in 2017, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
so it's very recent, right?
Right.
And of course, once the Fearless Girl, which is the result of that, which is now a huge tourist attraction. It's, it's that girl with a ponytail, in that power mode, feet apart, hands on the hips. When that was unveiled, and it was unveiled opposite the Charging Bull, which is another huge tourist attraction. Well, first of all, the firm that had commissioned Fearless Girl was very soon after had to settle claims of gender and racial malfeasance. The usual. I mean, there are always settlements, right? So, but it was sort of ironic that they were commissioning this to up their gender diversity equality profile. In fact, they had to pay money because they weren't doing that. And then in addition, and they're also trying to wrestle control of and rights to Fearless Girl from the woman who created it. Anyway, but then in addition, the guy, the artist, the male artist who created Charging Bull started to get really jealous that there was so much attention on Fearless Girl. So she had to be pulled out and transported. She's now staring straight at the New York Stock Exchange, but she's no longer interacting with the bull. She's just standing there completely alone. Like, you could be, if it weren't for all the tourists taking pictures, you could, and I have in the past actually, you could trip on her. Because if you're just walking down the street, she's just randomly there. And this really says something, I mean, it says so many things, again, these efforts for equality, how ironic they are in many ways, and the fact that the Charging Bull artist couldn't withstand the competition and got her moved. I swear. I mean,
saying a lot about him.
It says a lot about him, but it says, it does.
Our culture.
About him, of course. But I just thought it was a wonderful story to encapsulate so much of what these women have gone through. And in that sense, I think she is now the perfect sort of artistic representation of women on Wall Street.
And a lot of women, period.
Yes.
Paulina, where can people find out more about you?
Well, I have a website, paulinabren.com, and there you will see reviews as they come in. They're looking good.
Yes, they are.
Yes, the Washington Post, one of the most anticipated books for the fall. And also events, so readings I'm doing and so forth. That's as it happens, it's going up there. So if you want to come see me, just take a look.
The other thing, She Wolves is in development with Mark Gordon Pictures. Let's not forget
so
about that.
Let's hope. I've learned Hollywood is fickle. So
it doesn't matter. You get to say that
nice
now.
It's
you
nice
never know.
Yeah.
You never know.
That's precisely it. It's fickle, and therefore you never know.
And it's an untapped New York's best NYC books of all time, and Lit Hub's most anticipated books for fall of 2024. The She Wolves of Wall Street. Paulina, thank you so much. The book comes out on the 17th, and we are taping this just a couple of weeks before that. So congratulations, and thank you again for being with us a second time. And we'll look forward to whatever you're coming up with next.
Great. Thank you so much, Sylvia. This was a delight, as always.
You can find us on all of your popular podcast platforms. And of course, our website, sylviaandme.com. Stay safe, stay healthy, and as always, stay tuned.